Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The latest U.S. Consumer Price Index report, or CPI, shows inflation further dropping to 2.9%, the first time to fall below 3% in more than 3 years. Though that is good news, it's not enough to offset the U.S. bleak July employment report and an unemployment spike, maintaining concerns that the world's largest economy could still be gliding towards a possible recession. Is soft landing still possible? Why do most Americans say the economy is going in the wrong direction? And what are the main problems facing the U.S. that could influence the global economic landscape? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Steve Kin, crowd-funded professor of economics on Patreon, Michael Song, director of the Institute for Digital Finance Innovation at Zhejiang University, and Radhika Desai, a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. Welcome to the show. Well, Radhika, we'll start with you. So now, as we said, there are good news, there are concerns about the employment market. So how do you describe or characterize the current U.S. economy?
Well, the way in which I would characterize the current U.S. economy is I would agree with you that essentially what has happened is that it looks as though with the latest employment figures, the U.S. economy's, the idea that, Jerome Powell can sort of negotiate the interest rates and the inflation battle and so on in a way that would give the US a soft landing, that's over. I think the recession is essentially imminent. It's quite possible that it might even happen, the US might be in a recession before the next US elections, which would be quite an important development. So basically, it's not looking very good.
Michael.
Because this jobs report was very low. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes. Michael, when you look at 2.9% CPI, I mean, moving toward the goal of 2%. So inflation-wise or fighting inflation-wise, that's that's a normalization process because the Fed is achieving its goal of containing inflation, right?
Yeah, well, certainly. The recent 2.9 inflation number is encouraging. However, it actually, there are other things to consider, right? If you look at core inflation, which doesn't include food and energy, and these tend to be the more volatile components, that's persistently much higher than the 2.9, right? And we're going into potentially a number of geopolitical tension with conflict. OPEC might, restrict supply, which would send energy, oil prices, skyrocketing. So I think we're in a very tense position, right? I think in general, the market sentiment is that the Fed will actually cut rates going into September, but it has to balance itself. It's in a very, I think, tenuous and difficult position. There's a lot of structural issues. The economy is, you have to fight inflation on one side, and you have these unemployment numbers, and then there's all sorts of potential crises looming, including commercial real estate. 1 trillion of loans is going to come due in the next 2 years. You have banking, crisis, potentially hundreds of banks with overexposure in commercial real estate could go to under. I think there's 63 banks on the federal watch list. So it's a very tight balancing act to follow.
A balancing act. Steve, obviously, if you are trying to suppress inflation, I mean, you increase the interest rate, of course, that somehow will affect the economic growth. I mean, if you want to achieve economic growth at the same time to, containing the inflation rate, somehow, of course, that's ideal situation, but it's very difficult to achieve. Once you achieve the control of the inflation, somehow maybe you are bordering a recession?
Well, the only thing I can frame the current situation of the American economy in is the old cliche, too many cooks spoil the broth. Because yes, you've had the Federal Reserve putting up interest rates, believing that's what controls inflation. In fact, they're wrong. The fall in inflation that occurred, I think, has been quite independent of the increase in interest rates. Their models tell them that putting up rates reduces inflation. The real world is different. And those rates are actually increasing the economic activity in America, because now that they're paying 5% or so on American government bonds, that is an enormous income source for the holder of those bonds, which are mainly the financial sector, but also quite a few wealthy individuals have that money. That's boosting the economy. The government is still running a deficit of some size after COVID. That is also boosting the economy. But the banks have put up their mortgage rates and their business rates quite substantially on top of the increase in government interest rates, and that is suppressing demand from the corporate sector for credit. But it hasn't affected the housing sector, because most Americans have 30-year fixed rate interest by paying mortgages, and therefore the rate haven't changed. It's only cutting off demand from the new borrowers, who of course are not going to be willing to borrow when they're paying 8% on the loan they might take out, when the interest inflation rate is about 3%. So it's quite a mess, and I think what's going to come out of it may be more driven by energy prices and effects of that nature, which are driven by OPEC and driven by resource shortages around the planet. So as I said, I don't know what it's going to taste like, but it's not a particularly appetizing drink or soup.
Well, Steve, what do you make of this, job market, the numbers, in particular the unemployment rate, has increased basically from May to June to July, 4.3%. I mean, how bad news is that to the economy?
Well, the stock market is pretty much irrelevant to the economy. The stock market has its own private dynamics, and the level of speculation and exposure people have to speculation more drives its ups and downs than anything happening in the real economy. It is a worry that the rate of unemployment is picking up, but bear in mind that the historical average rate of unemployment for America is fairly close to 4%. So it's not a catastrophic growth in unemployment like happened with the global financial crisis. The difference between now and 2007 is that the global financial crisis was driven, the boom beforehand was driven by far too much credit, far too much private debt, boosting aggregate demand and income by adding 15.5% of demand to what was there from the turnover of existing money, and then falling to minus 5%. Now, I don't see anything like that happening this time around, because largely banks are far less willing to extend credit than they were back in 2000 to 2007, and borrowers are less willing to take it on. But everything else that's happening, frankly, the parlor state of American manufacturing, that causes all sorts of supply chain blockages and extraneous costs, which China avoids because it has a far more sophisticated and domestic supply chain. So I think America is in a mess, but whether it's going to mean a recession in the immediate future, I'm still agnostic on that particular call.
Mm-hmm. Well, radical, of course, some people are calling for action from the Federal Reserve immediately. Others are waiting for, say, more policy discussion in September, because people point to like 2021. When there's price hikes, but the Fed insists it's transitory, it's not inflationary pressure. But of course, the Fed proved to be wrong, and then we see the wrong rate increase, interest rate increase over the past couple of years. So do we need action now, or we should wait for more data in August, in September?
I think that when you ask that question, you have to realize that the Federal Reserve always justifies its actions in relation to levels of unemployment, inflation, growth, etc., etc. But in reality, its real motivations are actually governed by by considerations of financial stability. The Federal Reserve has only one instrument, at its hand, which is essentially interest rate and monetary policy. And as they say, if all you own is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. So what they try to do is they are using the only instrument they have against inflation. But of course, the real cure for inflation is not to increase interest rates, which simply creates a recession sufficiently strong that it will essentially dampen demand at some point, which is kind of what it may get at some point in the near future. I think that's very likely. But the real reason that the Federal Reserve is the real considerations that the Federal Reserve takes into account when raising or lowering interest rates are what it's doing to the financial sector. So essentially, there are lots of people today calling for an easing of interest rates. Why? Because the increase in interest rate is threatening asset markets, because the asset markets rely on leverage trading. People borrow lots of money cheaply and then use it to make money in the asset market, sending up the prices of assets, and then of course they return return the money with the low rate of interest, leaving them with a big pile. This kind of trading and this kind of asset markets are threatened when the Federal Reserve must raise interest rates to fight inflation, which is why the Federal Reserve has not done anything remotely resembling what it did in the late 1970s and early 1980s, which when interest rates were allowed to go up to 20%. At that time, the United States did not have the extensive financial sector, the vastly inflated bubbles in the asset markets and so on. That is what you have now. So, and the other thing you have to remember is that the last time the Federal Reserve was forced to raise interest rates, which was back in the mid 2000s, it did the same thing. It slowly increased interest rates notch by notch. But by the time they got to about 5.25%, it pricked the 2007, it pricked the housing and credit bubbles in 2008. We are already at that level now. We already have seen the rumblings of a crisis. Of course, the financial sector is a little bit more regulated, a little bit more resilient, but not that much. So I think the Federal Reserve is not going to raise interest rates, even if inflation persists. It will now lower interest rates, partly in order to ensure that the wealth of the wealthy, which relies on asset markets, is preserved. As for the problem as for the ordinary people, the problem the Federal Reserve has is that raising interest rates to this point, and it can't go much further, has not induced the level of recession that they would need to stamp out inflation. So basically, and if you, what I did a little while back is I mapped the interest rates and the inflation rates onto each other. And what you can see is that compared to before about 2000, in the new century, the Federal Reserve has had to become a lot more tolerant of inflation than it had been in the past. And the reason is because they now have these low and easy monetary policy based asset bubbles, which they have to keep inflated or keep inflating.
Well, Michael, you mentioned about the CPI number does not include, for example, energy prices, and then there are surveys for the public. People seems are not that happy with the economy in general, despite most people would agree. I mean, economists would agree the U.S. economic performance is strong, but somehow people don't feel that way. There is a gap.
Yeah, absolutely. I think consumer sentiment is actually at an all-time low, and I think we need to talk about a few elephants in the room, right? During the Great Depression, right, there was actually a recovery after 1929. Is only in 1933 when we really felt the pain, right? So there was actually recovery. There was a little bit of an artificial bubble. And everybody was, getting back into it. And then there was the real hard landing crash, right? And so I think this right now sentiment is very low across various dimensions. There's a lot of geopolitical instability. The U.S. is now actually sending warships into the Middle East region as we speak. That potentially is a very large conflict, in addition to already Ukrainian war, Russian war from before. We're in very unprecedented times, right, for geopolitical tension. Also, another major issue is the fact that the U.S. Debt is extremely at all-time highs, $34 trillion. Debt servicing alone on interest payments is, almost $900 billion. That's 16% of federal spending. That's 2.4% of GDP. And it's 1/3 higher than just a year before. That is unsustainable. And the only way that the U.S. can get out of it is to print money. 80% of US dollars have been printed since 2020. Okay, and it cannot go on forever. Now you have BRICS and ASEAN plus, outright saying that they're going to de-dollarize. So I think the currency is going to be, attacked pretty soon. The petrodollar has been dominant for many years. You see that Saudi didn't re-sign that agreement. There's a lot of historic, epic sort of changes in the market. And then you throw on things like, getting back to the employment picture, things like AI, right? Complete structural transformation in the labor force with technology disruption, also the trend toward a gig economy post-COVID. So it's no surprise that a lot of Americans and people around the world feel a lot of that not so rosy about the future. Yeah.
Steve, you were shaking your hand on some of the points, obviously. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, the interest rates, I agree with your female speaker, the interest rates are far too high. But what they're doing is they could actually prick asset bubbles, because people are now looking, do I want to rely upon a rise in the stock market, or am I going to accept 5 or 6% on government bonds? The government bonds are safe. The stock market is not. So that particular rising interest rates could actually cause fragility and a fall in the stock market. But the other side, and I'm disagreeing with the male speaker here, interest rates paid by the government in America, in American dollars, are created exactly the same way the deficit is financed, which is by fiat. The government creates the money that finances the payment on bonds. It does not borrow it from the private sector. It cannot go bankrupt in its own currency. Now, what's actually happening is that these worries, which show how little most economists actually understand how money is created, are causing all sorts of contrary policies. And this confusion is partly why we're in a mess right now. The government can continue paying those rates, but if it reduces the rates, as well as taking away the fragility of the financial sector, it will also reduce the income of the financial sector and anybody relying upon bonds. Now that can feed back in and reduce aggregate demand. So, and also people fantasize and worry about the level of government debt. They never talk about the level of private debt. The level of private debt is 1.7 times, roughly, the level of government debt. And that is ignored by mainstream economists, and that is what caused the global financial crisis, and it's why we're still in a funk 15 years after it.
Okay, so obviously the debt is not something we like that much. But I would turn to Radhika. We talked about, Michael talked about this geopolitical situation too. ASEAN situation, Saudi Arabia, like a de-dollarization. Of course, the geopolitical tensions, in the Middle East, in Ukraine. In 2013, your book, Geopolitical Economy, after U.S. hegemony, globalization, empire, you made predictions about the U.S. Dollar, U.S. finance and the financial system. Well, you also talked about the finance, probably too much there. How is the current situation compared with your prediction? Is the current situation part of your prediction, actually?
No, that's a really good point. So basically, my point has been that, in the United States, there is an entire industry of people whose purpose is to talk up the dollar. There's no problem with the dollar. When after the dollar's gold link was broken, people say, oh, look at, the dollar has continued to serve as the world's currency, and they point to all sorts of markers of its strength. But what people fail to look at is that since 1971, if the dollar has remained the currency of the world in a substantial sense, it has done so only on the basis of a series of successive, what I call financializations, a series of expansions of purely financial activity, which is then essentially creates enough demand for dollars to counteract the so-called Triffin dilemma, which is that since the United States offers liquidity to the world by running balance of, by running deficits, the larger the deficit, the lower the value of the dollar. So if you create a sufficiently large expansion, financial demand for dollars, this will, it will counteract the dilemma. Now, what's happened since 2008, and this is, all of this has been was what I predicted, is that this is an unsustainable situation. It cannot go on. And since 2008, substantial parts of the external investor class have reduced their purchases of US dollar denominated assets, and so that support for the dollar has gone away. So we see, for example, over the last couple of years in particular, Janet Yellen issued some kind of advisory on how the treasury market is not as liquid as it should be, and this is supposed to be the most liquid market in the world. The Federal Reserve has had to step in to support the treasury market because there are not enough buyers of treasuries, and so on. So given all these problems, I think that what's going to happen is that, and given that the United States could very well be close to a financial crash, maybe we are already in a slow motion financial crash, I think this will further give impetus to de-dollarization. The de-dollarization is happening because the rest of the world is essentially waking up to the dangers of using the US financial system. And even before this trend kicked in, there have always been critics of the dollar system. There is absolutely no reason why the dollar should be the world's currency. We need alternative arrangements. There is no reason why any national currency should be the world's currency. Keynes knew that. He recommended Bancor and an international clearing union way back in 1944. He was, at that time, the United States ensured that it would be rejected so that the world would be left with no alternative to the dollar. But now, and having the dollar system over the last 50 years has subjected the world to financial crises, has subjected the world to a giant financial system that is predatory upon the productive economy. It does not aid the productive economy. All of these things are problems, and I think the sooner we move away from that to a more sensible system, the better it will be.
Steve, you are nodding your head this time around. So financialization is a problem
yes,
here?
Very much agree. Very much agree with those comments. This is something that you can survive a crisis here, but if you've started off with a bad foundation, you're going to have one eventually. And the bad foundation was in Bretton Woods. Keynes proposed an international currency which was not owned by any particular nation, the Bancor, and the American, Harry Dexter White, I think it was, basically American arrogance coming to the fore, said, no, we want to be the national currency. And what that set up was that ultimately there's more demand for American dollars than there were for American goods. The dollar gets overvalued. You destroy ultimately your manufacturing capability. America's not the powerhouse it was 60 years ago in manufacturing. China is now that powerhouse. That we needed to have an international currency. It was a huge mistake, and we are watching part of that rolling out of that mistake of not following Keynes's advice back in 1944.
What would be the consequences if we continue this, the current system, the current practice? Steve,
well, I mean, the financialization, America is a financial beast, it's not a manufacturing beast now. And that causes disturbances through global markets. That's why we have had financial crises. Not the only reason, but a major amplifier of the financial crisis we would otherwise have had. So, yeah, we desperately need initiatives like I know China and Russia were talking about at one stage of bringing in a version of the Bancor and getting away from this huge mistake. But what it means is fundamentally America is a country which can't respond, generally speaking, to the manufacturing challenges it faces. And what we're going to face in the foreseeable future, the very near future, is consequences from global warming that are going to require a manufacturing response that America is no longer capable of making. So, you know, it's pick your crisis. We've got plenty coming our way.
So, Radhika, I mean, what is the alternative like a system internationally in the ideal way if we don't continue to rely on the US dollar with a global rule there?
Absolutely. If I may just add one more thing to what Steve just said, I just want to point out that the reason why the reason to believe that the United States will go into a recession is that the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which was precisely the act which was supposed to boost American manufacturing, particularly in the direction of green energy and in terms of electronics and chip making and so on. We have just been reading news in the last week or so that a very substantial part of the projects initiated by this Inflation Reduction Act have been essentially been cancelled or delayed or whatnot because of problems inherent in American manufacturing. So that's, I just wanted to add that the Inflation Reduction Act was supposed to be the one big thing that was going to essentially lift US manufacturing up and so on. It's not happening. It's been delayed. Now, to answer your question, this is a very important question, and I feel that there's a lot of murkiness, a lot of deliberate muddying of the waters in the debate around the dollar, because, as I said, there is an entire academic industry whose purpose is to talk up the dollar. So one of the key arguments they raise is that, oh, well, there is no alternative to the dollar. The renminbi is not ready. The euro is failed. The yen can't do it. So there must be, the dollar will continue. No, the point of noting these internal problems of the dollar system, which is creating that it is reliant on financialization, that these financial bubbles could burst, that external investors are already withdrawing from US asset markets. All of these things are to say that the dollar system has internal contradictions and it will crash. And when it crashes, if the world is not prepared with alternative arrangements, it will be badly hit. Now, the good thing is the alternative arrangements are being made. And if you were to create a Bangkok style system, even with a substantial number of countries, if not all the countries, a key thing to remember is that you are not creating a new currency of the sort that you and I would use to buy a bar of chocolate or to pay for a restaurant meal. We are going to create a currency which will be used by central banks only to clear imbalances among them, while all countries will continue using their own national currencies and manage them in a way, hopefully, that will be conducive to their own growth and development, as Keynes would have wished. That's why Keynes tried to, the purpose of the system that Keynes created was that it would create a fair way of settling imbalances between countries, while at the same time give the countries concerned the autonomy to design their monetary and fiscal policies in a way as to be conducive to growth and development. And this is the great merit of the system. That was what we need. That's what we need to do. A lot of people start talking about a new currency of the ordinary sort. No, it will be a central bank, inter-central bank currency only.
Yes. Michael, we mentioned about the U.S. manufacturing, but if you look at the U.S. manufacturing PMI, for example, dropped to 46.8 in July, the lowest rating since late 2023. We know that the PMI below 50 indicates a contraction in the manufacturing sector. In the U.S. has tried very hard to revive their manufacturing sector. So where are they now?
I think, as our other guests have indicated, American manufacturing is in a dire state. American has offshored manufacturing for decades. It's not going to be coming back anytime soon. The government is not prepared to invest in the structural or infrastructure necessary to reshore that manufacturing. It's been outsourced to places like China, and now because of the decoupling, or de-risking, as is now commonly known, all that manufacturing, that dependency on China is just shifting to other countries with extra steps before getting back to the U.S. So at the end of the day, the U.S. is just as reliant on China for manufacturing as it ever were. I've been talking to a lot of technology companies here in Silicon Valley. I can say that all the name brands that you can think of, all the hardware manufacturing they're doing, they're outsourcing to contract manufacturers in China. Okay, we're talking not just the manufacturing, but now the verification and even the design. Okay, because it's just vertically integrated. The cost structures and these economies of scale are just too compelling. There's no way that the U.S. will be able to do that, reshore that anytime soon.
Stop there. Thank you, Michael. And with that, we come to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qianduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.